Daniel 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was tranquil in my house and vigorous in my palace. I saw a dream that frightened me, and my thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head bewildered me. I issued a command to bring before me all the sages of Babylonia, so that they should make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the necromancers, the astrologers, the Chaldean stargazers, and the demonists came. I related the dream before them, but they could not make known its interpretation to me. At last, there came before me Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And I related the dream before him. Belteshazzar, chief of the necromancers, since I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret is hidden from you, this is the vision of the dream that I saw. Tell its interpretation. These were the visions in my head upon my bed. I was watching, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth. The height of it was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens. It was visible to the end of the entire earth. Its foliage was beautiful and its fruit plentiful, and there was food for all in it. Under it beasts of the field took shade, and the birds of heaven nested in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. In the visions of my head upon my bed I was watching, and behold, a holy angel came down from heaven. He cried out loudly and said thus, "Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Cast down its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the animals move away from under it, and the birds from its branches. However, leave its major roots in the ground, secured with a band of iron and copper in the herbage of the field. Let it be washed by the dew of the heaven, and let its lot be together with the beasts in the grass of the earth. They will change its heart from that of a man, and a beast's heart will be given to it, and 7 periods will pass over it. The matter is by decree of the angels, and the sentence is by word of the holy ones, so that all living beings may know that the Supreme One rules over the kingdom of man, giving it to whomever he wishes, and appointing the lowest of men over it. This dream I saw, I, King Nebuchadnezzar, and you, Belteshazzar, tell its interpretation, because all the sages of my kingdom are unable to make the interpretation known to me. But you can, for the spirit of the holy God is in you." Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was silent for a while, and his thoughts confounded him. The king exclaimed and said, "Belteshazzar, let the dream and its interpretation not bewilder you." Belteshazzar replied and said, "My lord, may this dream be upon your foes, and its interpretation upon your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached the heavens, and which was visible to the entire earth, whose foliage was beautiful and whose fruit plentiful, with food for all in it, under which dwelled the beasts of the field, and in whose branches nested the birds of the heaven. It is you, O king, who have grown and become powerful. Your greatness has grown and reached the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And that which the king saw, a holy angel, came down from heaven and said, 'Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its major roots in the ground, secured with a band of iron and copper in the herbage of the field. It will be washed by the dew of heaven, and its lot will be with the beasts of the field, until 7 periods pass over it.' This is the interpretation, O king. It is the decree of the Supreme One that befalls my lord the king. They will drive you from mankind, and your dwelling will be among the beasts of the field. They will feed you grass like oxen, and wash you with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods will pass over you, until you recognize that the Supreme One rules over the kingdom of man, and he gives it to whomever he wishes. As to that which they said to leave the major roots of the tree, your kingdom will remain for you, after you recognize that heaven rules. Nevertheless, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Redeem your sin through righteousness and your iniquities through kindness to the poor. Perhaps there will be an extension to your tranquility." All this befell King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months he was walking atop the royal palace of Babylon. The king exclaimed and said, "Is this not the great Babylon, which I have built up into a royal house with my powerful strength for glorification of my splendor?" While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. To you, O King Nebuchadnezzar, we say, the kingdom has departed from you. We are driving you from mankind, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field. They will feed you grass like oxen. And 7 periods will pass over you until you recognize that the Supreme One rules over the kingdom of man, and he gives it to whomever he wishes. At that moment, the decree befell Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from mankind. He ate grass like an oxen, and his body was washed by the dew of heaven, until his hair grew like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' talons. At the end of the 7 periods of years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes to heaven, and my senses returned to me. I blessed the Supreme One, and I praised and glorified the Eternal One, whose rule is an eternal rule, and whose kingship is for all generations. All the inhabitants of the earth are reckoned as nothing, and he acts according to his will with the host of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At that time, my senses returned to me, and I returned to the glory of my kingdom. My appearance came back to me, and my ministers and nobles sought me. I was reestablished over my kingdom, and additional greatness was given to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, extol, and glorify the King of heaven, whose actions are all in truth, and whose paths are in justice, and who is able to humble those who walk proudly. Daniel 5. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine before the 1,000 guests. While under the influence of wine, Belshazzar gave an order to bring the golden and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, had removed from the sanctuary that was in Jerusalem, for the king and his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines to drink from them. So they brought the golden vessels that they had removed from the sanctuary of the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king, his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, copper, iron, wood, and stone. Just then, fingers of a human hand came forth and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, facing the candelabrum. And the king saw the palm of the hand that was writing. The king's appearance thereupon changed, and his thoughts bewildered him. The belt around his waist opened, and his knees knocked one against the other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldean stargazers, and the demonists. The king exclaimed to the sages of Babylonia that any person who would read this writing and tell its interpretation would wear royal purple, with a chain of gold on his neck, and would rule 1/3 of the kingdom. Then all the king's sages came in, but they could not read the writing and make its interpretation known to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly bewildered, and his appearance changed upon him, and his nobles were confounded. As a consequence of the words of the king and his nobles, the queen came into the banquet hall. The queen exclaimed and said, "May the king live forever. Do not be bewildered, nor let your appearance be changed. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in your grandfather's days, brilliance, understanding, and wisdom, like the wisdom of God, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, made him chief of the necromancers, astrologers, Chaldean stargazers, and demonists. Since extraordinary spirit, intelligence, understanding, interpreting of dreams, solving of riddles, and resolving of difficulties have been found in Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be called, and he will relate the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought before the king. The king spoke up and said to Daniel, "You are Daniel, from among the people of the exile of Judah, whom the king my grandfather brought from Judah. I have heard about you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that brilliance, understanding, and extraordinary wisdom are found in you. The sages, the astrologers, were now brought before me to read this writing and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not tell the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard about you that you are able to provide interpretations and to resolve difficulties. Now, if you will be able to read the writing and make its interpretation known to me, you will wear royal purple with a chain of gold on your neck, and you will rule 1/3 of the kingdom." Daniel then replied and said before the king, "Let your gifts remain yours, and give your rewards to others. But I will read the writing for the king and make its interpretation known to him. You O king, the supreme God gave kingship, greatness, honor, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all the peoples, nations, and languages used to tremble and be frightened before him. Whomever he wished, he would kill. And whomever he wished, he would keep alive. Whomever he wished, he would raise up. And whomever he wished, he would put down. But when his heart grew proud, and his spirit was hardened to rebel, he was deposed from his royal throne, and honor was taken from him. He was driven from mankind, and his heart was made like a beast's. His dwelling was with wild asses, and they fed him grass like oxen. And his body was washed with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the supreme God rules over the kingdom of men, and that whomever he wishes, he appoints over it. But you, his grandson Belshazzar, did not humble your heart, although you knew all this. You exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house were brought before you. And you, your nobles, your concubines, and your consorts drank wine from them. And you praised the gods of silver and gold, copper, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, nor hear, nor know. But the God in whose hand is your soul, and to whom all your ways belong, you did not glorify. Thus the palm of a hand was sent from before him, and it inscribed this writing. This is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, counted. God has counted the years of your kingship and terminated it. Tekel, weighed. You have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. Peres, broken up. Your kingdom has been broken and given to Media and Persia. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel in royal purple with a chain of gold on his neck. And they proclaimed about him that he would rule 1/3 of the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. Daniel 6. Then Darius the Mede received the kingship at the age of 62 years. It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the kingdom, and over them 3 viziers, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps would give advice, so that the king should suffer no harm. Then this Daniel oversaw the viziers and satraps, because of the extraordinary spirit in him. And the king thought to appoint him over the whole kingdom. Thereupon the viziers and the satraps tried to find a libel against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find neither fault nor corruption, because he was faithful, and nor could error nor corruption be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any fault with this Daniel, but we will find it in him through the law of his God." Thereupon these viziers and satraps assembled about the king, and said thus to him, "May King Darius live forever. All the viziers of the kingdom, the nobles and the satraps, the advisors and the governors have conferred to affirm the king's law and to strengthen his prohibition, that whoever will make a request of any god or man for 30 days, other than of you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's pit. Now, O king, approve the prohibition and inscribe the writing so that it cannot be abrogated, according to the law of Media and Persia, which shall never lapse." As a result of this, King Darius inscribed the writing and the prohibition. When Daniel learned that the writing had been inscribed, he went home. He had windows open in his upper story, facing Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he fell to his knees and prayed and gave thanks before his God, exactly as he used to do before this. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and supplicating before his God. So they approached and spoke before the king concerning the king's prohibition. "Did you not inscribe a prohibition that any person who would make a request of any god or person for 30 days, other than of you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's pit?" The king replied and said, "The matter is true, according to the law of Media and Persia, which shall never lapse." Then they exclaimed and said before the king, "That Daniel, who is one of the people of the exile of Judah, has not paid attention to you, O king, and to the prohibition that you have inscribed. 3 times a day he prays his prayer. Then the king, when he heard this statement, was deeply grieved, and he set his heart on Daniel to save him. And until sundown he strove to rescue him. Then these men assembled around the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that the law of Media and Persia is that any prohibition or statute that the king establishes cannot be altered. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's pit. The king exclaimed to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve continually, save you. A stone was brought and placed over the opening of the pit, and the king sealed it with his signet ring, and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that his will regarding Daniel could not be changed. Then the king went to his palace and went to bed fasting, and had no table brought before him, and his sleep wandered from him. The king arose in the darkness before dawn and went in haste to the lion's pit. When he drew near to the pit, to Daniel, he cried out in a sad voice. The king called out and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve continually, able to save you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they did not wound me, because merit was found for me before him. Also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was very pleased, and he commanded that Daniel be brought up from the pit. Daniel was brought up from the pit, and no wound was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. The king gave the command, and they brought those men who had slandered Daniel, and they threw them into the lion's pit, them, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the floor of the pit when the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote, To all the peoples, nations, and languages who dwell in the entire earth, may your peace be abundant. An order is hereby issued by me that in all the dominion of my kingdom, people shall tremble and be in fear before the God of Daniel, who is the living God and endures forever, whose kingdom will not be destroyed, and whose dominion is until the end, who saves and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has saved Daniel from the clutches of the lions. This Daniel met with success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So here is this man who is substantial, and he keeps having these dreams, and all these necromancers and all these people, they don't have the slightest idea what he's talking about but Daniel. So clearly, Daniel is operating at an entirely different level. Yet Nebuchadnezzar remains extraordinarily arrogant and haughty. He does this golden statue. Now he has this dream that shows that this guy, he's going to basically go crazy. He's going to run away. He's going to live in a field. He's going to eat grass like a cow. And this is going to happen for 7 years. Then the dream shows that he's going to get his kingdom back. He's going to have added glory to him. And the result of all of these things will be that he will praise the God of Daniel, Hashem, the God of Israel. Many years pass. A whole world happens. People die. People are born. Parties. Things are forgotten. Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, is in his palace and he's having a wonderful time. He's got his concubines. He's got his best friends. He's got his guards. He's got all the people. And he says to himself, what would make this better is if we were to go to the temple, take all of the golden vessels, and then we'll drink out of them, because that's cool. So between the time of Nebuchadnezzar's revelation that God is supreme and the time of this grandson, something clearly was forgotten. Either Belshazzar never got the message that the God of Israel was legit, don't mess with him, or he doesn't care. So literally, the writing on the wall foretells his destruction. Now think about it. As this guy was partying, maybe even as they were bringing the vessels up the stairs to his palace, the Medo-Persian army was crossing the border into his land to destroy him. This is when Daniel gets to flex a little bit because he's older, he's been around, nobody calls him anymore. He sees the writing on the wall. He's like, yeah, I know that. I know that writing. So I'll be happy to tell you what it is. It means you're finished. And Belshazzar, he dies that night. When Darius the Mede assumes the power, he gives to Daniel the same power that Nebuchadnezzar gives him. I mean, this guy. Nevertheless, these guys are interested in destroying Daniel. They don't like that he has power or influence. They don't like that he's a Jew. They just don't like him for some reason. Likely because he's totally awesome and he knows everything and the king respects him. They establish some sort of a ruse to get the king to agree that prayer is evil. Daniel gives exactly 0 beep. He goes to his house. He prays 3 times a day. He doesn't even close the curtains. What do you think the king was thinking when he realized that he had been suckered? These scumbags, they forced his hand. Yet he is the king. But then, what could possibly have been passing through his mind when he's sitting there looking at Daniel in the pit of these lions? And I don't know, maybe he's like tickling one of their bellies. I don't know. But he's not dead. You got to imagine that Darius must be thinking to himself, oh, okay, I'm going to get this thing squared away. Darius must be so relieved. Daniel's not dead. The God of Daniel did keep him safe. He is legit. And then instantaneously he said, I'm going to kill me some suckers. I don't know how you would explain how something like the lion's pit happens. But I love that it did happen. Daniel, the good guy, is saved and the dirtbags and their families eaten alive. Oh, this is a good one. Thank you for watching. The NQE is out.